Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to really get into a pretty complex and, let's be honest, sometimes controversial topic.
Yeah, we're talking about the role of the father figure, both in our own lives individually and maybe in society more broadly.
Exactly. And we're using a specific critical piece as our guide here. It's called The Cult of the Father-Daddy Issues as Destiny, a psychoanalytic and cultural critique of Jordan Peterson's paternal paradigm. Quite a title.
It is. So our mission for this deep dive really is to unpack Peterson's main arguments. Why does he think the paternal is so crucial?
Uh-huh.
And then look at the sort of psychological and cultural ripple effects of those ideas.
And importantly, explore other ways of thinking about this too, right?
Absolutely. The source material we've got gives us a good look at Peterson's own concepts, but also a whole range of critical takes on them. So lots to discuss.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it, about, what shapes us. Have you ever really considered how much that presence or maybe even the absence of a father figure could shape your own beliefs or even how society is set up?
It's a huge question.
Okay, well, let's try and unpack some of that today. Where should we start? Maybe with Peterson's core argument.
Right, let's do that. So Peterson's central idea, according to our sources, really hinges on the necessity, symbolic, psychological, societal of the father.
The father as a concept.
Right. He sees this figure as a key ordering principle, a kind of bulwark against what he calls chaos.
That's a theme you see a lot in his work, like 12 Rules for Life,
Hmm.
right? Order versus chaos.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
fundamental for him. So the key takeaway here seems to be that he frames sticking to traditional structures, which are often patriarchal, as a necessary defense against things falling apart.
Okay, and this connects to his concerns about the modern world.
It does. He talks about a perceived crisis of meaning. And he suggests this comes from drifting away from those traditions. And he even mentions a, quote, feminization of culture.
Right. Linking gender to these big concepts, order, chaos. That seems pretty important to his whole framework. What are the implications there?
Well, he frequently links order symbolically with the masculine, the paternal. And conversely, chaos gets associated with the feminine, the maternal. And the source material notes he's also worried about what he sees as female dominance of institutions.
Hmm.
And he's pushed back against the idea of, quote, so-called oppression of the patriarchy. He seems to view these shifts as part of that crisis of meaning.
So it's bigger than just individual dads. He's talking about a kind of archetype.
Precisely. He draws on Jungian psychology here, introducing the great father archetype.
Carl Jung, yeah.
Yeah. And Peterson uses this to explain why he thinks societies naturally lean towards hierarchies and established norms. This archetype for him embodies order and the known.
The known, like familiar structures, rules.
Exactly. Established ways of doing things, social norms, habits that help us navigate life. He paints it as the wise king, the protector against the unpredictable.
The one who provides stability sets boundaries. Makes sense. But the source also says it's not that simple, right? There's a flaw to that.
Definitely. Peterson does acknowledge this duality. The great father can be benevolent, guiding, but if that order becomes too absolute, too rigid,
It becomes tyranny.
it can, yes, it can morph into a dominating tyrannical force. He does say order can become excessive, and that's not good.
So it's a balancing act. Structure versus rigidity. But it feels like his main worry is still the chaos side.
That's a key observation. While he acknowledges the danger of tyranny, his consistent focus tends to be on chaos overwhelming us.
And since he links chaos with the feminine.
Well, the implication is that the tyrannical aspect of the father, though acknowledged, might be seen more as a corruption of a necessary force rather than an equal danger to the chaos he associates with the feminine.
Okay. And this great father representing the known. That
Yeah.
connects to tradition too. So challenging tradition is
Potentially inviting chaos, yeah. If the great father stands for order in the known, and that's tied to existing cultural systems, then anything questioning or trying to dismantle those systems can be framed as an agent of chaos.
which elevates sticking to tradition, often patriarchal tradition, to something more than just preference. It's like defending meaning itself.
According to his framework, yes, with the paternal figure as the ultimate guardian of that meaning.
Okay, so that's the great father. Now, what about this rescue your father metaphor? That sounds really central.
It is, definitely. He uses it a lot. It comes from Pinocchio, rescuing Geppetto from the whale, right?
Yeah.
But the father here isn't just, your actual dad. Symbolically, it's the highest possible value, the ideal. Could be God or father culture itself.
Law Square.
Lost in chaos,
Mhm.
in the belly of the beast, the unconscious, the unknown.
So rescuing him isn't just a nice story. What's the practical meaning Peterson takes from it?
The rescue, as he frames it, demands facing real hardship, making sacrifices, really challenging how you see the world. It's about digging up the wisdom of the past, the stuff embedded in tradition, to breathe new life into the culture.
So it's about growth, individual growth.
Very much so. This whole quest for Peterson is tied to becoming a more complete person by facing down those challenges. It's about reaffirming those paternal coded structures.
It connects back to that order-chaos balance again.
Yeah.
Don't cling too tight to the past, but don't reject it completely either.
Exactly. And if you look at it psychoanalytically, that journey into the belly of the beast, which in his framework often gets linked to the feminine, the great mother, to retrieve the paternal, that's significant.
How so?
It mirrors that classic hero's journey, right?
Yeah.
Descending into a symbolic feminine space, emerging renewed, and reinforcing order, which in Peterson's context often seems to mean restoring or boosting paternal authority.
That's a really layered metaphor. Now, the source also touches on his personal life, his relationship with his own father. Does that seem to connect to these ideas?
It seems likely, yeah. Peterson describes his own father as someone who gave him unshakable confidence, but was also extraordinarily demanding. He even compared him to an Asian tiger mother in terms of expectations.
Wow. So total belief, but relentless critique.
He called it a weird position, yeah, that mix. And he stresses his parents' honesty, too.
And wasn't his first big book, Maps of Meaning, rooted in a letter to his father?
It was, yes. That letter to my father is seen by commentators as really foundational emotionally and philosophically. It kind of foreshadows this later focus on fathers. And think about his advice. Aim to be the strongest person at your father's funeral. That really speaks to his view of generational transitions needing strength, responsibility.
So that personal experience, demanding but supportive father, seems to feed directly into his promotion of the strict father model we hear about.
It aligns very closely. The idea that you build moral strength through discipline, through facing difficulty, that resonates with his description of his dad.
And the never satisfied part might link to the rescue your father thing.
Yeah.
Always striving.
Could be, yeah. That continuous striving. And maybe that unshakable confidence he got from his dad contributes to his own, very authoritative public style, that certainty that appeals to many.
Okay, so we've got the framework. Great father, rescue metaphor, personal links. Now let's turn to his diagnosis of society's problems, this idea of daddy issues being widespread. He sees fatherlessness as a major crisis.
Oh, absolutely. He argues very strongly that fatherlessness is a huge problem. Biological, psychological, societal consequences. He's even said it's, quote, destroying America.
Strong words. What kind of consequences does he point to? Biologically, even.
Yeah, he cites specific things. Studies suggesting girls might hit puberty earlier without fathers present, or boys might have shorter telomeres, which implies, maybe shorter lifespans.
Really? Telomeres? Huh. And socially?
Yeah. The list he connects to father absence is long and pretty stark. Increased risk of poverty, substance abuse, mental health problems, delinquency, suicide.
Wow.
Especially for males, he notes overrepresentation in things like alcoholism, addiction, crime stats. He even sees single parenthood rising as a sign of the degeneration of a society.
And marriage is primarily for kids, in his view.
Primarily for providing stability for children, yes. Now, the critical point raised in our source is that while fathers are important, blaming all these complex issues solely on their absence might be, well, an oversimplification.
Right, because correlation isn't causation. It's easy to link things, but proving one causes the other.
Exactly. Our source points out that his causal claims often bypass really important mediating factors, things that were already there, potentially.
Like what?
Like pre-existing poverty, the kind of neighborhood you grew up in, conflict within the household, the mother's education level, other tough childhood experiences. These things have a massive impact.
So father absence might be part of the picture for some people, but it's not the whole story.
That's what the broader social science suggests, yeah. When researchers control for those other socioeconomic factors, that direct causal link between just father presence, absence, and outcomes often becomes much weaker, or sometimes disappears entirely.
And we shouldn't forget the resilience of single moms, or how society itself can make things harder for single-parent families.
Absolutely. And Peterson's tight focus on the absent father can maybe unintentionally draw focus away from those bigger systemic problems.
Okay, let's look closer at the solution he seems to propose, this strict father model. What does that actually involve?
Well, it starts from the view that the world is tough, It's dangerous even. And you need moral strength, character built by facing that hardship, not being shielded from it.
So the father's role is.
Setting clear boundaries, pushing for responsibility, encouraging independence, not coddling. The core message is kind of like, I know this is hard, but I know you can do it. Fostering that inner grit.
He has some specific rules too, doesn't he? Like the one about kids' behavior.
Yeah, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. That's one of his 12 rules. It emphasizes shaping behavior through clear expectations and consequences.
And this model fits his wider message about taking responsibility.
Directly. Taking responsibility, bearing your burden. Even rules like stand up straight with your shoulders back. Echo that call for self-discipline, facing the world head on.
Okay, now let's bring in some of the critical analysis again. The source talks about father hunger and how that might relate to Peterson's appeal. What is father hunger?
It's described as this deep-seated longing, often unconscious, for affirmation, guidance, and maybe even clear limits from a male authority figure.
And the idea is that maybe some of Peterson's audience feels this.
Commentators suggest that, yeah. Especially perhaps young men who feel adrift, looking for that kind of fatherly advice. It connects to the concept of the absent father wound, too, the psychological impact when that paternal figure is missing or inadequate.
But again, the source urges caution. Right. Not to reduce everything to just daddy issues.
Exactly. While that wound is real for many, saying it's the only reason someone struggles or seeks guidance is too simple, we have to remember all those other factors we mentioned.
Poverty, community context, conflict, education, trauma.
Right. Research often shows those things can be just as, if not more, predictive of outcomes. And again, we need to acknowledge the strength in many single mother families and the societal biases they might face. Peterson's intense focus can kind of obscure that wider picture sometimes.
Which brings us to this idea of Peterson as an internet father figure and the whole cult discussion that sometimes surrounds him. That's a really charged aspect.
It really is. There's no denying he's become this huge figure for many, particularly young men maybe feeling lost or searching for masculine identity.
You hear people call him a surrogate dad.
Yeah, or internet father figure, offering mytho-intellectual fatherly advice, as one source puts it. And you absolutely find many testimonials saying he changed their lives. This can be understood partly through that father hunger lens we just discussed.
But there's a debate about whether this intellectual daddy thing, as some call it, is actually empowering or not.
That's the crux of the critique. Does this intense admiration actually help people grow up? Or does it risk creating dependency? Critics argue it can hinder becoming your own person, developing your own internal authority, becoming your own father, metaphorically.
There are accusations of projection, too.
Some suggest the followers' focus on daddy issues might reflect their own unmet needs. You see terms like JP cult stuff suggesting it's about seeking a patriarchal daddy.
But the counterargument from supporters is
But he's not fostering dependency. He's giving them a mental toolkit for autonomy, tools to take responsibility.
so distinguishing between a helpful mentor and blind worship.
Right, but there's undeniably a tension there. His message is self-reliance, yet the devotion some show seems intense. You see things like Daddy Peterson used, sometimes affectionately, sometimes critically. Online groups dedicated to critiquing him pick up on this. It's complex.
Okay, let's shift back to a core piece of his positive message. The link between responsibility and meaning. How does the father figure fit into that?
This is absolutely central for him. He says it outright. Responsibility, that's what gives life meaning.
Not happiness.
Not just happiness. Meaning comes from willingly taking on burdens, facing suffering head on, committing to a higher good, sacrificing for the future.
And the father's role is to instill that.
In his view, yes. The father figure is crucial for teaching responsibility, for pushing individuals to seek and embrace meaning in this challenging way.
And he contrasts this with a different kind of influence.
He does. He often sets this demanding paternal offer against what he calls the Oedipal mother, or perceived feminized ideas of care, which he sometimes suggests can be infantilizing.
So the ideal father pushes you, tells you could be better.
Exactly. That message of you could be more than you are is part of that ideal father's role, encouraging constant improvement and engagement with difficulty.
Okay, we've mapped out his ideas pretty well. Now, the source really digs into deconstructing this paternalism. Let's start with the feminist critiques.
Right. So from a feminist perspective, that core chaos feminine versus order masculine split is seen as a big problem.
Because it reinforces old stereotypes.
Exactly. Stereotypes used historically to justify unequal power. His critiques of the Oedipal mother, his apparent anxiety about female power, feminists interpret that as concern that women gaining ground might undermine masculinity or traditional structures.
And the focus on the absent father.
Feminist critiques challenge that narrow focus. They stress the validity of diverse families and point to bigger systemic issues like economic inequality that impact everyone.
What about his views on patriarchy itself?
Well, his skepticism about the oppression of the patriarchy and his comments on female dominance of institutions are seen as defending traditional gender roles, basically arguing that culture is or should be fundamentally mythically male.
And the feminization of culture idea.
Often interpreted less as a real crisis and more as a way to project broader societal anxieties onto gender dynamics.
Okay. What about psychoanalytic or trauma-informed viewpoints? How do they critique Peterson's approach?
The main point here is that relying so heavily on broad, universal Jungian archetypes can kind of flatten things out. It risks missing the complexity of individual trauma, unique personal histories.
So it's too general.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
A trauma-informed perspective, like you might see from someone like Dr. Gabor Mate, puts more emphasis on compassion, validating people's pain, and looking at the systemic sources of trauma.
Which contrasts with Peterson's emphasis on toughening up.
It can, yes. The dismissal of victimization is often seen as problematic from this perspective. They might look at Peterson's own anecdotes differently too, like the story about his mother during a fight, perhaps seeing potential unresolved emotional impacts rather than just independence.
And therapists have concerns?
Some worry about applying his advice universally without knowing someone's trauma history. Could it be harmful for some? His critique of APA guidelines for boys, focusing on fatherlessness over potential harms of rigid traditional masculinity, is another area of concern for these critics.
So the risk is the archetypes overshadowing individual lived experience, especially trauma.
That's the core critique, yes.
And finally, the sociological challenges. What's the view from that angle?
Sociology tends to put much more weight on those big systemic factors, poverty, education access, neighborhood resources, as the primary drivers of social issues rather than just father absence.
So they see Peterson as focusing too much on the individual.
They critique what they see as a tendency to attribute problems to individual moral failings instead of fully analyzing the social and economic context that shapes choices and behavior.
What about set your house in perfect order?
Some sociologists see that as potentially depoliticizing. It can discourage looking at and acting on systemic inequalities by focusing solely on individual self-improvement first.
The argument being that individual solutions just aren't enough for deep-rooted social problems.
Exactly. They argue his individualistic approach falls short when dealing with issues that require collective structural change.
Okay, so if Peterson's paternal model has these critiques and limitations, what are some alternatives? The source mentions some models that move beyond that singular focus.
It did. One example was the self-healing communities model.
What's the focus there?
It's really about building strong community networks, shared leadership, rather than looking to one single authority figure for all the answers.
So spreading the support around.
Yeah. And other community approaches consciously try to move away from just talking about the absent father. They focus on the strengths that do exist in diverse families and stress giving kids honest, age-appropriate information about their own situations.
These models challenge the need for that one paternal figure.
They really do. They emphasize mutual support, shared agency. It's a different way of thinking about resilience and well-being.
And what about the feminist healing narratives mentioned?
These are really interesting. They're described as women-centered stories, often from women of color, focused on communal healing.
How do they work?
They aim to dismantle patriarchal ways of telling stories about trauma, reflecting unique, often interceptional experiences. Women are seen as active agents in their own healing, but within supportive, egalitarian communities.
So a collective action is key.
Very much so. Collective action against various oppressions, reinterpreting cultural traditions in empowering ways. It's quite different from Peterson's individual hero's journey.
More relational, communal, embodied healing.
Exactly. Less about emulating a specific paternal ideal. You know, when you look at all the intense reactions, both positive and negative, to Peterson's ideas about fatherhood, it just shows how potent that father symbol still is in our culture.
Yeah, it definitely taps into something deep, a desire for order, maybe, but also clearly a lot of pushback against simplistic paternalism.
Right. There's that yearning, but also these really significant critiques.
It certainly makes you reconsider the whole daddy issues thing. Important, yes, but maybe not the whole destiny the original title implies. We need to be careful about being too deterministic.
Absolutely. Peterson's framework clearly resonates and provides meaning for many people. But looking closely at the source material, you see the limitations, the potential oversimplifications, the risk of neglecting systemic issues, and the vast range of human experience.
So the final question for you listening is maybe this. Thinking about your own life, about society, about these powerful archetypes, how can we find meaning, build resilience in ways that go beyond just one blueprint, especially a paternal one?
What does all this actually mean for you?
Definitely something to chew on after this deep dive.